this is the adult. We're kind of updating the latest adult active life survey. So that brings us up to November 2024. That brings us up. So this is data for November 23 to November 24. And I'm not going to start there though. I'm going to start with a couple of things that I think you need to just be mindful of as you listen and think about the data that I'm going to be presenting. The first thing is that this is population level data, okay, for Worcestershire. The sample's about 2,500, I think it's about 2,400 adults over the age of 16 are filling an online survey on a rolling basis throughout the year. Okay, it's at least 400, around 400 in every local authority. Some of the local authorities get a larger sample because of higher levels of inactivity or because of a larger population. But across Worcestershire as a county, it's about 2,400 responses on an annual basis. So we're in this right-hand side of the diagram. Okay, this is outcome level data at a population level, and we're looking in particular, the bits that we're interested in are what's happening with inactivity, what's happening with the inequalities, what's happening with activity levels, basically. And they're in our sphere of interest, and they're in our sphere of interest because they're population level outcomes, right? And there's lots of influences of what encourages them to go up or to go down. And then we've got the things on the far left, which are the things that we do and the context that we do it in. Okay, and that context is unique in Worcestershire compared to Herefordshire, but it's also unique in the different parts of Worcestershire. You know, between the different local authority areas, between the different communities, that context is always changing. It's always in flux and looks very different in different communities. And then we've got the things that we can do. And one of our challenges is to think about the things that we can do and whether they're contributing or not to shifting those outcomes. Okay, and so we've got this bit in the middle, and this diagram has come from some work by Dr. Katie Shern as part of the National Evaluation and Learning partnership with Sport England's Place Investment. And one of the challenges that we've got in all of the areas that we do this work is trying to fill the gap in, okay, between what we do and whether it's having an impact on those population level outcomes. And what we've got now through the work of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership is some conditions that the evidence base that's coming out of their work is suggesting that the state of these conditions in our places affect the outcome, okay, and whether the outcome changes or not. And so I've tried to put a little you know, hopefully you can see the top right. You might not be able to see the one in the middle. And we've got a little bit more, I wouldn't say control, but these are a little bit more in our gift to shift is probably the best way to describe them, those nine conditions. And one of the things that we're doing with Loraya, Simon and Steve is that strategy work and starting to think about how Active Herefordshire and Worcestershire starts to contribute to working with partners to be able to shift these conditions, because to shift these conditions it takes collective effort. No one organisation can do it, and so we need collective effort in order to be able to create better conditions in order to hopefully produce better outcomes. And so what I want you to just keep in mind here is when talking about population level outcomes, and that there are many influences of why they might be going up or down as we go through the slides. Okay, the other bit that I'm just going to put into your head as well, again, which is not about physical activity, but I think you just need to be conscious of some of the things that are going on within our population that may be contributing to whether it's active or inactive. And I'm just going to pick up on a few key trends that are worth having in mind because they're quite interesting. And the summary is in the bottom right corner, really, that our population is continuously changing year by year. It shifts, and over the last since the pandemic, we've had a very interesting economic picture, particularly in terms of the cost of living crisis that is still playing out, and again is affecting our the way that our population looks and the money it has in its pocket on a year-by-year basis. And I'm going to just bring that to life a little bit. So this is about the population. In Worcestershire, it continues to grow. Okay, and so we've got this steady increase in the number of people that are living in Worcestershire, and we've continually to have a growth in the number and proportionate number of older people in our population. As the baby boomer generation gets into the over 55, over 65 age group, we've got more people, and they're living for longer. We've got more people over the age of 65, and these two factors are important, right? Because we've got more people in our place, that our organizations that need to provide services for, and they're getting older. Okay, we've got a greater proportion of older people, and we're now up to 28% of the population over the age of 65. And that's important because we know as we age, inactivity increases. Okay, so we will come back to what that data looks like a little bit later. The other bit that we've put in the pack this year is around income. Really, in essence, it's around income, because there's some quite interesting national level trends that are playing out locally in very different ways locally, but they're still playing out nonetheless. One is we've got more people in Worcestershire claiming universal credit. You can see it's increased by over 7,000 in the last 12 months. We've got more children and young people experiencing poverty, so that would suggest family incomes are a challenge for a greater number of families. We've got an increase in trend. Now, it's not as bad in Worcestershire as it is in other parts of the country, but we have got a little bit of an increase in trend around people that are of working age, but are long-term sick or disabled. And the unemployment situation in Worcestershire at a macro level over the year isn't that bad, but that will differ, be quite different between different places. So when we look at these Worcestershire trends, we just need to keep in mind that we've got more older people. Our population is bigger. We've got more older people, and actually we've got this data would suggest more people that are potentially living on lower incomes, and we know that's a factor when it comes to thinking about physical activity behaviour. So let's get into the physical activity bit. I will describe some of the terms that I use as I go through, if that's okay. But if there's anything that I don't pick up, please do just put your hand up, and I will try and deal with it as we go. So as I've mentioned, the Adult Active Lives survey is carried out on a rolling basis throughout the year. It gives us data on whether people are achieving the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation of 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. Okay, I've used that phrase moderate intensity for a purpose, and I will come back to it on the next slide or in a couple of slides time. But just to explain what you're looking at the moment, we love a bit of a wiggly worm. These are, if we start with the red dots at the bottom, that is the proportion of inactive adults over the age of 16 in Worcestershire for the, whatever that year, 9 years of data that we've got now. Okay, and that's the proportion that are inactive. To be inactive, you need to be doing less than 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. Okay. I will come back to the intensity bit later because it's important. And as you can see, it's relatively stable, both of these trends. The green dots at the top are the proportion that are achieving the 150 minutes. The grey lines faded behind them are the other lines for England. Okay, and it's not a bad comparator for Worcestershire because the populations are similar, but I would make a couple of observations in the sense that Worcestershire has slightly more people in higher socioeconomic groups, if I remember, that are more likely to be active, but it's got a slightly older demographic profile as well. So it's a reasonable comparison, but there are some differences. But the biggest difference is it's more white British than the national population. That I think it's about 90% white British compared to about 75%, something like that. I'd have to check those figures, but I know for sure that Worcestershire population is less culturally diverse. And so we need to just keep that in mind when we're looking at this data. But as you can see, apart from the pandemic years when it pushed inactivity up a little and activity levels dropped a bit, it's bounced back and it's relatively stable. If you go from baseline to the latest, you can see there's very little difference. So we've got a pretty resilient population when it comes to movement, which is positive, and we've recovered from that lift up in activities that happened nationally when the pandemic hit. Of course it did. It pushed, we were told not to go outside apart from to walk for an hour for quite significant periods of time in 1920 data. So and then supply stopped, didn't it? You know, leisure centres closed, sports clubs couldn't open, etc., etc., etc. And it's taken time for that to come back. And Worcestershire, like England, has come back, and we're pretty much back to where we were pre-pandemic, which is a positive situation. Let's turn that into a number. Okay, it's quite a lot of people that are inactive. 125,000 people roughly across the whole of the county, but we've got to think a little bit more nuanced than that, and this is where we get into the definition of the Chief Medical Officer's uses to describe what inactivity, you know, to put people into this inactivity bracket. It does a number of things, and I'm going to explain that on this slide. Okay, so we have that term, moderate intensity. It's in the recommendation for the Chief Medical Officer because we need to get our heart rate up to get cardiovascular health. Okay, so but it's not running, it's not sprinting, it's not really, vigorous intensity exercise is really good. It counts double when it comes to the way that they manage the minutes, but it's actually for most people a brisk walk, and you are into moderate intensity physical activity, and it's basically your heart rate lifting up, you'll feel warmer, you may start to sweat, and for the vast majority of the population it's a brisk walk. Okay, so when people fill in this survey and it asks them what kind of activities they're doing, it then asks them whether their heart rate raises, whether they feel a bit warmer, you might start to sweat. If people say no, okay, they're put into low intensity exercise, okay, low intensity minutes, okay. And if you're just doing low intensity minutes, of which a lot of people are doing quite a lot of low intensity minutes and not getting their heart rate up, they're deemed as inactive, and that's the middle group in this slide. So we've got around 8% of the population, which equates to 43,000 people that are doing some exercise, some movement, some walking and gardening are the two main activities that they're doing, but they're not getting their heart rate up. So they're put into the inactive classification because they're not getting the cardiovascular benefit. And then you've got 1% that are doing between 1 and 29 minutes. So in total, you've got around 9% of the population, 50,000 people, that are doing something, but not enough. And the reason why I'm labouring this point, because compared to the 75,000 people to the left that are potentially will include quite a lot of people that are habitually inactive, the tactics that we need to think about are probably quite different. That group that are moving quite a bit, probably thinking that they're getting their minutes, walking their dog or walking to work or whatever it is, but not doing it vigorously enough to get the cardiovascular benefit. Gardening's another good option of that. Then maybe campaigning would work. Maybe getting the message out there around get your heart rate up, get the benefits, so on and so forth. Possibly those kind of tactics would work with that part of our community, whereas the left-hand side of community, those kind of tactics are probably irrelevant. I want us to be thinking about those different tactics when we start to think about reaching and working with our community, because it's quite important. I'm going to move us on. Okay, I'm going to start to just look into certain parts of our community now, and in particular, I'm going to be looking at people with a limiting illness or disability, our diverse communities as much as I can, because our sample falls apart a little bit there. I'm going to look at whether there's a difference in gender, because we know that has been particularly a challenge nationally since the pandemic arrived. The gap between men and women activity levels was closing pre-pandemic. The pandemic arrived and opened it up again, which is quite interesting. And so I'll look at what that situation looks like in Worcestershire. And then I'm going to look at some of that difference between, and I'm actually going to start here, that difference between income levels, socioeconomic status, and I'll explain what I mean by NSX 6 to 8 on the next slide. So I'm just going to start to explore these different parts of our community and what activity and inactivity in particular looks like for those different groups. Okay, What you've got on your slide now are the activity levels for two groups, and this is NSSEC. And what on earth is NSSEC? When every household in the country completes the survey, it answers, I think, 6 or 7, I think it might be 7 questions. It's things like, what job role does a chief income earner in the house do? What kind of income bracket have they got? Have they got a degree? What kind of work do they do? How big's the organisation that they do their work in? There's a number of questions that are asked, and the Office of National Statistics use those questions, the responses to those questions, to put every person in the country into NSSEC 1 to 9. Okay, let's deal with 9 because it's the easiest. 9, which isn't on this group, is full-time students and people that haven't filled in the 6 or 7 questions correctly that they can be put into a classification. And then the rest of us are put into NSSEC 1 to 8. NSSEC 1 and 2, so the light grey towers, so 17% of this group was inactive in 2015-16, and it's 15% of that group in 23-24. NSSEC 1 to 2 are people that are professionally qualified and senior management directors, chief executives of companies, particularly larger companies. They're more likely to have professional qualifications, they're more likely to have higher level qualifications, they're more likely to have higher incomes. It includes occupations like solicitors, accountants, and so forth, and then medical professions and so on and so forth. And that part of our community, potentially because they're more affluent, are more likely to be active and less likely to be inactive. Then you've got NSX 6 to 8, so they're the dark grey towers, and you can see how that's fluctuated, particularly since the pandemic came along, but it's back down to where we were at the baseline, which is quite intriguing and positive. NSX 6 to 8 are people in routine, semi-routine, and long-term unemployed, never worked. Okay, that's NSSEC 8. What on earth is routine and semi-routine work? Labouring, cleaning, some retail work jobs, drivers, unskilled drivers, and what I mean by that is not people that haven't passed their driving test, but people that haven't done a technical driving qualification. So think your delivery drivers that might be turning up at your doorstep delivering your Amazon parcel. That kind of work is routine, semi-routine work. And the bit that I'd like to just have us keep in our head, because it's really important, is that this survey does not ask about minutes at work. Okay, so they're not in this data. And one of the things that we need to bear in mind when we think about our routine and semi-routine work is they are more likely to have some kind of manual element to them than other socioeconomic groups. Okay, and so they're more likely to maybe spend their day on their feet, maybe doing some low intensity minutes. Some of that work will be actually moderate intensity minutes, and technically it would count towards the outcome if it was collected, but it's not collected. And we need to keep that in mind, because certainly in parts of Worcestershire there will be kind of industrial work and warehouse work, but there'll also be agricultural work. And so the workforce, I think it's about 32-33% in Worcestershire of our population that fits into NSX 6 to 8, and we aren't taking into consideration any data about minutes they may have achieved at work. Now, the evidence out there would suggest to us that a lot of those minutes are low intensity. So it would increase, I mean, inactivity would possibly, stay like it is, but we've got a lot of people that are spending their day on their feet and maybe doing a lot of walking, but not getting their heart rate up. And I'm really intrigued about, well, how do people feel about going and moving more when they've been moving or stood on their feet all day? My mum used to work on a market stall and would stand on her feet be on her feet for 10-12 hours a day, and the last thing that she wanted to think about when she came home was moving more. And so there's a space there, potentially through our place-based work that we've got going, potentially through other means that we could do with trying to understand this better, what it looks like locally, what people feel like that are in manual work, and how many minutes they might be doing, and what it makes them feel like about them trying to go and do some more movement and getting their heart rate up. I'm going to move us on. our sample, because Worcestershire isn't as diverse as England, our sample when it comes to different ethnic groups is quite small. We get enough data to look at these three groups. Obviously, white British is a large part of the population, so the sample there is very robust. When it comes to our Asian communities and people of white other heritage, the sample's enough, but we haven't got any data on here for black, for example, or for other ethnicities because the sample just isn't big enough. Okay, and you can start to see that actually we've got higher levels of inactivity when it comes to our more culturally diverse communities that we can actually get data for. And I can also tell you that both of those groups, inactivity has increased in the last 12 months because we had data for both of those groups last year. And we don't get it every year, particularly for white other. It's been a bit mixed, and well, actually for both of them, but we have for the last couple of years. The sample does seem to be getting better, which is good. And inactivity, I wouldn't say I can say it's increasing and getting worse, but it's certainly got worse in the last 12 months. So something for us to be thinking about, and particularly in thinking about where that demographic factor might intersect with lower incomes in particular, and I will come back to that kind of intersecting characteristics a little bit later. I'm going to move us on now. Oh, my computer, there we go. And then we're moving us on to looking at what the trend looks like for inactivity amongst people with limited illness or disability. We can see that there is a bit of a downward trend on this over from baseline, which is positive. When it comes to no limited illness or disability, it's pretty stable. Remember, this is around, if we go off the population, if we go off the census data, this is around 19% of the population. So 1 in 5 people have a limited illness that affects their day-to-day activities. If we had health data, it's probably quite, not necessarily affecting their day-to-day activities, but it's probably quite bigger in terms of people that are living with a long-term condition. And we've always had this inequality. We know that as soon as the first condition kicks in, inactivity, the likelihood of being inactive doubles. Okay, and it's been like that. It's like that across the country, and it's been like that for quite some time. And there's a lot of great work. I was in an event with Lorraine and Steve and Kerry yesterday around. There's a lot of great work happening in health. There's a lot of direction, particularly coming out of the NHS with the 4-way forward around actually how we need to do more in integrating physical activity into our health and care system, and try and shift the dial on how we use movement, both for the prevention but also for the management and treatment of conditions, because the evidence is overwhelming that for the absolute vast majority of people with a long-term health condition and disability, movement is one of the best things that they can do. And so we've got really interesting work that hopefully we can continue this trend over time, heading in the kind of direction. If we've lost another 8 percentage points in the next 9 years, I think we'd be pretty happy. So let's just keep an eye on what that's doing. It's gone up in the last 12 months, but the overall pattern is going in the right direction, which is positive. Be interested to hear whether you've got any comments about when I stop in a minute. I'm just going to do the gender slide, and then we'll have a little break. This is inactivity for men and women, and interestingly, in Worcestershire, and the pandemic actually affected men more than it affected women, which I thought is quite interesting. And Worcestershire is not the only place where that's occurred, and I will be coming back to this in a minute or two. But at the moment, there's very little, and for the last few years, there's been very little gender inequality with the data that we're getting, which is a real positive, because that gender gap at the moment, nationally, I think, off the top of my head, is around 4 or 5 percentage points. It was down to about 2.5 before the pandemic, and it's opened up quite significantly, and it's not yet closing, which is quite intriguing. So we've got a different situation in Worcestershire, and our work might not necessarily need to be focused on women necessarily, and I'll come back to that later, but we do know that when we bring in second characteristics, that there'll be some parts of our female population that are much more likely to be experiencing inactivity. Let's move this on to age. Now, This is a little bit of an interesting pattern. Okay, I want you to just look at the blue shaded bit, the light blue pale shaded bit. That's the normal trajectory. It's not as low as that at the top. Don't think about use that as scale, but this norm is a gradient, a steady gradient. If you look at this data nationally, it's usually a steady gradient. Okay, with our younger age group, our 16 to 24-year-olds, likely to be the most active, and the inactive is likely to be the smallest. And then it goes up a little bit by age groups. Usually, that's what often the normal pattern is. It ain't in Worcestershire, and whilst the inactivity levels for our young, right up until the 65 are below the average for the whole population, you've got this really interesting little lift in 25 to 34-year-olds. And I would also say that your 16 to 24-year-olds, it's probably not as low as I'd expect it to be, which is quite intriguing. Now, we are seeing this pattern in a number of different areas where our younger population in this year of data, we're seeing higher levels of inactivity. Now, I know nationally for Sport England, they've been interested in the 16 to 34 age group. They've been quite interested in that group for a while, because there are signs nationally that inactivity is increasing amongst that age group, and they're doing quite a bit of work on trying to understand why. And I'll come back to some of the characteristics of why a little bit later. But we're seeing in Worcestershire that age group 25 to 34 standing out from the pattern, which is, it's not massively out of the pattern, but it is quite interesting, especially when you start to look at those middle age groups. And then there's no surprise, 65 and over, higher than the average, and you get this really significant increase in inactivity levels. Why? Let's go back to one of the previous slides. Health conditions are starting to kick in, and much more significantly in that age group. And so we've got quite an interesting age profile. It gets even more intriguing when we go on to the next slide, because what we've got here is quite a different pattern when it comes to men and women. Okay, so 16 to 24s, it's females that are pushing that kind of, or bringing us up to 19 kind of as an average across men and women. But then you look at the next three age groups, and actually it's men that are in this latest year of data that are more likely to be inactive than women. We're seeing some quite interesting patterns elsewhere, as I mentioned, in a similar vein to this, younger men falling into inactivity. Now, we haven't spent time trying to unpick that in any detail just yet, but it might be something that we might want to have a look at. I'm not saying that, obviously the men are our priority. That is certainly not what I'm saying, but we're seeing it, and not just in Worcestershire. It's a bit of a challenge in some of activity levels around younger men. And we might want to just try and understand where that's intersecting with a different characteristic, whether that's ethnicity, whether that's lower income, whether that's, there's some really interesting data in Yorkshire, where there is and I'm going to come into this a little bit, actually it might even be the next slide, I might pop on, oh no it's not, where they're seeing an increasing trend, as I mentioned earlier, an increasing trend in people becoming working age people becoming long-term sick or disabled. And in Yorkshire and the Humber, that is being driven by men under the age of 30, which is really quite striking. And it's really being driven by two significant conditions: musculoskeletal and mental health conditions. And there's actually some really interesting work going on. I can't remember exactly where it is in Yorkshire. Might be Leeds or Bradford. It's one of the cities where they're doing some work on using sport to re-engage with this group of men that have fallen into economic inactivity. And I don't know whether that's at play in Worcestershire, whether it's significant enough to be, playing out in this. It might be something that we might be able to have a look at, because there is this pattern we're seeing in a few places, which is quite intriguing. Not everywhere, but we are starting to see it. So it might be something for us to just give a little bit of thought to understanding at some point. Deprivation. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the indices of multiple deprivation. It puts every little neighbourhood in Worcestershire and the whole of the country it gives it a score. And what we've done is we've broken it down. It's 1 to 10, but we've put it into quartiles. We've split it into 4 groups. Okay, and we've looked at levels of inactivity in our most deprived neighbourhoods compared to inactivity in our least deprived quarter of neighbourhoods. And you can see that inactivity is almost twice as high in our more deprived communities. That's roughly in line with national. What I would say is I see a much more significant gradient of inequality in other parts of the country. We've seen the left-hand side of this up near 40% and the right-hand side of this down at 10% in some parts of the country. So it's really quite a stark inequality. However, it's still twice as likely to live to be inactive in our more deprived communities. Now, we need to remember that our lower socioeconomic communities, lower income communities, are more likely to live in our more deprived parts of our place, and so there is certainly a relationship there. But we also need to remember that deprivation impacts across socioeconomic status. So living in a more deprived community, whatever your socioeconomic status, whatever your level of income, you're more likely to be inactive, which is a really intriguing factor, which then makes us really start to think about the environmental factors. What's going on there? What is it about those neighborhoods that isn't enabling movement? That's the space that we'd love to kind of get into with some of the place-based work that's starting to be put on the ground by Larea, and really starting to try and get our heads around what that looks like. This is that economic inactivity data that I mentioned a little bit earlier. Okay, what we know is that work is a great contributor to people being active. Okay, people in work are more likely in most parts of the country to be active and less likely to be inactive, and you can see that is absolutely the case in Worcestershire. Okay, and then it gets to these groupings that are outside of the workforce. You've got people looking after the house and children. So this group is about 90% female. And inactivity in that group is not a challenge in the latest data in Worcestershire. And then you've got people that are unemployed, you've got people that are retired. Obviously, age is a big factor for that retired group. And then you've got that growing proportion of people that I mentioned earlier that are long-term sick and disabled, and look at how high inactivity levels are for that group. It equates, I did this off the top of my head, so it could be slightly wrong. It's about 15,000 people that are economically inactive because of being long-term sick or disabled, that are of working age and are inactive. So it's a pretty sizable group now. And as I mentioned earlier, that group at the moment is it's increasing. There's more people falling into that group and out of the workforce. So it's something for us certainly to be thinking about. I'm going to go into the inequalities metric now. This is a couple of years. It's a factor that Sport England started doing a couple of years ago. Okay, I'm gonna put the slide up, but I'm going to explain something using the slide first for you to help just get your head around what you're looking at. Okay, but what Sport England have done a really interesting bit of statistical analysis around is not just single factor groups, like somebody that's on lower incomes in lower socioeconomic, in routine work, in lower socioeconomic groups, but actually what is inactivity like for when they're lower socioeconomic and they've got a disability or limited illness or disability. So they started to look at intersecting characteristics and what happens whether you've got one characteristics or whether you've got more than one characteristic, and actually what are the key characteristics for us to be thinking about. And I'm going to start by explaining the little diagram in the circle, okay, because it might not mean a lot to you until I explain it a little bit. So there's 6 characteristics that are statistically more likely for people with those characteristics are statistically more likely to be inactive. okay, and or not be active, because this slide's actually is about being active, okay, and those 6 characteristics are people that are of Asian or Black heritage. It is pregnant women and parents of children under the age of 1. Okay, and that's both men and women. Okay, so it's pregnant women and parents of children under the age of 1. It's people with a limited illness or disability. It's people in NSX 6 to 8 or lower socioeconomic groups. It's people of Muslim faith, and it's people over the age of 65. Okay, and those 6 characteristics are pretty significant on creating inactivity. So when you have 2 or more of them, it potentially really compounds the challenge. And so what you've got in terms of the data to the right is 73% of people without any of those characteristics are active. Okay, that's a pretty significant proportion of the population, and 73% of those people that don't. So I don't have a long-term health condition. I'm under 65. I'm male. My children are over the age of 1. And I'm of no religion. Okay, so in those, and I would fall into NSSEC 4 as a small business owner, and so I don't have any of those characteristics. Okay, so people like me, 73% of people in Worcestershire that don't have those characteristics are active. Okay, if you have 1 characteristic in Worcestershire, 62% are active. If you have 2 or more characteristics in Worcestershire, look at the plummet. Okay, we're now talking less than 4 in 10 that are active. Okay, so inactivity is going to have shot up through the roof for people with 2 or more characteristics. And I think this is some of the work that we need to try and understand through some of the work that the partnership is working with partners on around actually trying to get to people with 2 or more characteristics. I'm particularly interested in age and disability, but also disability and lower income and lower income across the board. You know, in some of our more diverse communities, there's probably a couple of parts of the county where we've got Asian and Black communities, and I'd be really interested in how well we know what's happening for those people in terms of experiencing being active or not, because we know. And by the way, just to give you an England comparative, you're wondering, well, why does this compare? 74% 0 characteristics nationally, 62% 1 characteristic, 44% for 2+ characteristics. So there's something around Worcestershire, rurality possibly, deprivation in some of our urban areas, that kind of thing, that's actually making it even more challenging for people with 2 or more characteristics to find a way of moving. So there's something for us to try and get our heads around that. I'm going to go into minutes now. I'm going to put there's a few slides in the pack that kind of explain the data, but obviously I'm here to do that. But also it shows the trend of kind of minutes overall. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to show you the breakdown today. And what I want you to do is I want you to just imagine in your head all of the different ways that we can move apart from work, because it's not in the data. And you know, whether we're walking, whether we're gardening, whether we're dancing, whether we're playing football, whether we're playing cricket, all of the minutes that are done by adults in Worcestershire. Okay, and the next slide is going to break it down and show you those different categories of where people get their minutes from. Okay, and I'll explain the categories. Now I'm on the slide. Okay, what you've got here is all of those minutes and a proportion of those minutes that we get, starting on the left, walking for leisure. Okay, so going for a walk, very white British activity, by the way, done I don't know whether it's increasing. That'd be a good thing for us to look at in terms of our culturally diverse communities, but it's done much less by our culturally diverse communities. I'll be blunt, it's quite a white British middle class thing to do. Okay, and 30% of all minutes in Worcestershire are done going for a walk, for leisure, for health reasons, for fun, for whatever, you know, going out with the kids, whatever it is. Okay, around 19%, so 1 in 5 minutes, are done in traditional sport. What on earth is traditional sport? It's all your running, it's all your swimming, it's all your football, all your cricket, all your rugby, all your badminton, all your tennis, all of your canoeing, you know, all of those activities that don't fit into one or the other, they're in traditional sport. Okay, and that provides about 90% of minutes in Worcestershire. You then get 17% of minutes. Adults get 17% of minutes in Worcestershire from gardening, roughly, and those categories. Walking for leisure, I think it's a little bit lower than national. Traditional sport is pretty much in line. Gardening is pretty much in line. Fitness activities a little bit higher. I think it's about 10 or 11% nationally. Fitness activities, all your Joe Wicks, all of you doing your dumbbells at home, all of you going to your classes for your Pilates and things like that. Yeah, all of those group activities, class activities, all of that, that's in fitness activities. So you're going to the gym at the leisure centre would be in fitness activities. Okay, you then have walking for travel. 13%. So we've now got 43% of minutes that are coming from walking alone. Okay, walking for travel is lower than England. The pandemic absolutely battered it, is probably the best way of describing it. It plummeted. Of course it did. We were told we couldn't go outside. Okay, and it hasn't come back in some places for whatever reasons. In other places it has. Who's more likely to walk for travel? Low socioeconomic communities, people from our culturally diverse communities. Why? Don't have a car. Okay, and so it's a forced movement, for want of a better description. That's blunt, because it might not be for some people. They might be absolutely choosing to do it. But it's got some really interesting motivational attitudes around it that maybe we don't understand as well as we need to, and it is displayed very differently. Younger adults are also more likely to walk for travel because they have to, because they've got a car. But when they get the car, they're middle class, they're more likely to walk for leisure. 6% roughly in all cycling. So that is your cycling to and from work, as well as going out on my mountain bike. Okay, and that's 6% of minutes, roughly in line with England, and then you've got 2% in dance. Okay, so that gives us our mix. Okay, but those activities display for different people in very different ways. Okay, as I've picked up on some of that, I'll say something about gardening. Okay, gardening increases as we age. Again, it's more of a white British thing. It's more of a middle class thing. And why? Well, we're in a pattern in middle classes that we get to a certain age, we probably move out of rented accommodation, buy a house, and we buy a house with a garden, which means we've got to cut the grass. Okay, that's my experience, by the way, that I'm explaining very coherently. Oh, I've got a garden now, I haven't got a lawnmower, better buy a lawnmower. So some of that comes because of the way life happens for parts of our community. And we need to remember, for some parts of our community, it doesn't happen like that. We know our Asian communities are much more likely to live in multi-generational households. They're much more likely to live in densely populated areas, and less likely to have, which are potentially less likely to have a garden. So that part of our community doesn't pick up minutes from gardening, and they're less likely to go for walking for a leisure. So straight away, we've got some big activities that provide minutes to the white British community that might help us understand why we've got some of the inequalities. So what do we need to think about there? What do we need to try and do? What is it that we've got to try and understand there in order to be able to create change is an interesting question that we should have a conversation about at some point. I'm going to move us on. This is a bit of a new analysis, because we did it for a part of Greater Manchester called Tameside. We're doing some work with them at the moment, and we started looking into minutes done inside and outside, and it's quite intriguing. Now, it's not a really intriguing story at this level. It's not a really intriguing story in Worcestershire, because it's slightly more higher than England. 76% of all minutes are done outside. Okay, of course they are. Walking for leisure, walking for travel, gardening, then just think of all of the sports that are outside, etc., etc. And about 24% of minutes are done indoors. Okay, so there we go. What does get interesting in this is potentially a bit of further analysis around the different activity types. What got really interesting, and the different groups. What got really interesting in Tameside, quite a big proportion are growing. Actually, it's about 10% of their population now is of Asian heritage. But it's growing, and it's growing rapidly, is that part of their community. And what was really intriguing is only about 59% of their minutes are done outside. So they're much more reliant on indoor space to do their movement. Why? Racism, safety, etc., 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 is some of the assumptions that we're making, and that's part of the work that Tameside needs to go away to do and understand. Because when you start to look at different groups, this looks quite different. Go back to that point that I made on the last slide. The way that we get our minutes changes depending on our demographic makeup. And our characteristics. So we understanding and getting into the detail of this might be important for some parts of Worcestershire for us to think about. This is my last slide. What on earth are you looking at? You're looking at a heat map, and each of those little boundaries are what we call lower super output areas. What on earth is a lower super output area? It is an area that has a rough, it's got what's the word? A bracket of people, not a bracket, that's the wrong word. A range of people in it. Okay, so each low super output area has up to 3,000, I think it is, people living in it, between 1 and 3,000 people. And this is the way that the Office of National Statistics organise the census data. They go down to output areas, which are up to 1,000, and then they go bigger and bigger and bigger. And what we've got here is some modelled data. You need to keep that in mind, that this is modelled data, and it's modelled nationally. Okay, there's some factors that are brought in for local authority areas, like the levels of inactivity as part of the model, but it is modelled, and it's modelled using the national data set. Okay, and what it does is it gives us it looks at inactivity in the different local authorities and the level of it, and then it looks at the population makeup of each of these little patches. Okay, each of these lower super output areas, and it estimates inactivity for each of those little patches. Okay, the darker the blue, the lower the inactivity. In some of our parts of our community is down at 18%. Okay, and look at the dark blue, it goes up to 23%. So because all we've done here is split it into an equal number of LSOAs that are red, orange, whatever that color is, yellow, light blue, and dark blue. Okay, there's an equal number of areas that are split by those 5 colors. It's really important to look at the range here. Okay, so the dark blue covers a range from 18% inactivity up to 23%. The 3 middle groups have got very tight brackets, 23 to 25 for the light blue. We're now over the average for Worcestershire, by the way, just so you clock that. We've got 25 to 7 for the yellow. We've got 27 to 29% for the orange, and then we've got up to 34% for the red. Okay, we need to bear in mind that those yellow, orange, and red areas are pretty much all over the average, and that's where our higher levels of inactivity lie. And it's not just our urban deprived communities, is it? Which is the quite interesting bit. It really does start to show us some of our more rural patches where inactivity is likely to be higher. There'll be different factors at play here. In some of those communities, age and disability will be at play, and in other parts of those communities, it'll be lower income that's at play, and ethnicity. And okay, so there'll be different factors at play, and we really need to, be considering those red patches in particular where inactivity is likely to be quite high. They would, in the main, follow deprivation data, but it doesn't always. Okay, and that's the intriguing bit with this. And it doesn't always, because of age and disability. Sometimes we see areas come up with quite high levels of inactivity, and they're actually quite affluent areas, or they're, and certainly less deprived areas, and they surprise people. And that's because the age profile is likely to be quite high, and there's likely to be quite a lot of people living with a limited illness and disability.